This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome back everyone to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. My name is Tony Black, and with me, as always, is Duncan Barrett. How you doing, Duncan?
I'm good, Tony. I'm good. I've had a Star Trek-filled week. I just got back at the weekend from a performance of the Ultimate Voyage concert in London at the Royal Festival Hall in London, which was fantastic. It was a really, really great experience. And I'm sorry you couldn't be there because we were hoping to meet for the first time in person, but sadly you weren't able to make it.
No, and I couldn't even send my doppelganger, Toby.
No.
It's really,
yeah.
Really I usually send him for occasions I can't make, but yeah, tragic. No, I am genuinely disappointed. I think you said in the episode that I was nursemaiding a sickly fiance. So
that's
yeah,
right.
I did have a noble cause. I was essentially
you did.
Dr. Bashir, if we want to.
You've promoted yourself. See, I said you were Tom Paris, but
yeah.
But there you go. Yeah, you make yourself the genetically engineered.
He is genetically superior. So
he is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I've got that. Yeah. I've got that going for me.
So if you do ever make it down to London and we, find a pub with a dartboard, I'll know to bear that in mind, right?
Yes. Yeah. Beware, because I will clean you when it comes to darts completely.
Yeah. No, it was fun. It was really great, the concert. I really enjoyed it, and it was nice to meet up with Clara as well and record our episode about music and Star Trek and so on. Though obviously we were doing that during the matinee performance, basically. So you could probably hear on the podcast there were bits of the kind of music seeping through from time to time, but we couldn't talk about the show itself because we hadn't seen it yet, obviously, but it was great. I mean, I know a lot of our listeners have already seen it because the show's been, all the way around the States, around the world. I think it's been to London before, actually. I think this is at least its second time in London, but definitely I'd recommend it. If it's coming anywhere near you anytime, then I say this to you and to the listeners, definitely get a ticket because it's well worth seeing.
Yeah, given I live in the Midlands and nothing happens in the Midlands, then I probably won't be in my city.
You get destination Star Trek. That's pretty
true.
Convenient for you, isn't it?
That is true. Which was where I first met the lovely Clara. Actually, she is great, Clara. I'm a big fan of Clara. She's lovely. And we first met, and her husband Ben, who's a gentleman. And we first met at Destination Star Trek. So that's true. That is true, actually. But yeah, I will snap up the Ultimate Voyage.
You should. I mean, for me, the thing that really struck me about it that I suppose surprised me was I kind of went in, expecting to get all the kind of big orchestral film scores I've heard over and over again over the years, and that you kind of think of as these big kind of grand concert pieces, and all of that is in there, and they all sound wonderful, and it's great to see the orchestra live and be in the room with them. But actually, the thing that really amazed me about the concert is that they flash up all these clips and so on a screen at the same time. So a lot of it is these kind of montages. So they'll play, for example, there's an extended version of Picard's flute tune from The Inner Light, which has been kind of worked up for an orchestra, and they'll play a sort of montage of scenes over the top of that. I mean, that one, quite an emotional sort of montage of scenes, really kind of tugging on the heartstrings. But then occasionally, the bits that I actually enjoyed more in some ways were with some of the TV episodes. They'd actually play a whole scene with the score for that scene. So they did A Mock Time, for example, and they did the one that actually really blew me away was they did the episode from Deep Space Nine when the Defiant's destroyed. Now, if you asked me what music plays over that, I couldn't tell you. I mean, it's not something that it's not like a theme that particularly resonates, but just seeing that scene up there on the big screen, seeing those actors giving those performances, hearing that music, first of all, you really kind of appreciate the music that ordinarily might be more in the background and that you probably haven't listened to. I mean, unless you've got all the CDs and you go through them religiously, you're probably not as familiar with those kind of scores. But the other thing that was really nice about it was I think it had a real kind of equalising effect. This concert, it kind of elevated the Deep Space Nine music, the Voyager music, up to a kind of equal level with these kind of, obviously big, famous Jerry Goldsmith scores, or do you know what I mean? The kind of big... sort of the pieces that we kind of identify as really kind of classic Star Trek music, and it kind of put them all on a bit more of a level pegging. And it also actually, for me, I'm a bit of a JJ verse hater, generally speaking. I'm not a big fan of those movies. Beyond, I kind of make an exception for. I enjoyed that one, but one of the things they did, because they have these montages and things, and they're constantly flicking back and forth between the different series, was I felt they really brought all of Star Trek into kind of one cohesive whole. They made it feel like it was all one thing. So, a show like Enterprise, which maybe people often think of as a bit of a kind of sort of unfortunate stepchild, or equally some people feel that way about Deep Space Nine. It felt like the whole kind of package, and including the JJ verse and those films, was kind of brought into one sort of experience. And this concert was designed, I think, in part to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And it really did that in a way by bringing all those elements together and kind of celebrating them as one thing.
It sounds terrific, and it's it is something I'm particularly gutted I missed out on. Yeah, if it's in your city, guys, wherever you may be, definitely check it out.
Get a ticket.
Yeah,
definitely.
Absolutely.
And we're not sponsored by the Ultimate Voyage, just in case anyone's wondering.
Sadly not. More's the pity. We might make a few bob.
Yeah,
but
no, that'd be nice.
You go.
Yeah.
Someone else who did good business in his day, and certainly if he was still alive, he'd be getting some serious royalty checks, is William Shakespeare, who... that's a great segue.
That's a masterful segue there.
I'm getting better at this. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, we did our part 1 exploration of Shakespeare in Star Trek. And we talked heavily about the original series and some of the original series movies like Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, etc. And this is part 2. We're going to be moving forward. We're going to be talking about more the Next Generation era and beyond, really, and how Shakespeare works his way into Star Trek, and through lots of allusions and lots of storylines and narrative tropes and things like that. And I think a big influence that we've both found is, apart from everything, and we talked about this last time, is The Tempest, isn't it, Duncan?
So obviously in the original series, we talked about a number of episodes where The Tempest is kind of very much felt in the background, where there's these kind of characters of Prospero and Miranda in particular are recreated in some form or another. But in the Next Generation, we see a return to the Tempest as well, particularly in an episode right near the end of Next Gen, actually, Emergence, which opens with a scene of Data performing as Prospero for Picard. It's a kind of a callback to an earlier episode where he's performing in a different Shakespeare play that we can talk about a bit later. But it's kind of interesting that it's Data who's giving this performance. It's Data in Next Gen who is very much interested in Shakespeare as part of his kind of understanding of what it means to be human, and that's something that Picard has imparted to him because Shakespeare is very important to him. But actually Data himself, I think, if you think of The Tempest, is very similar in some ways to the character of Ariel in The Tempest. We have in Next Gen this relationship between Picard and Data, where Picard is in this kind of teacherly role in a sense, and Data is both learning from him but also this kind of perfect conscientious helpmeet in a sense. He's very reliable, Data. He'll do whatever you ask him to do. He can do things magically quickly. He's very efficient and so on, and in some ways there is something in that relationship between Prospero and Ariel, which is a more problematic relationship because there's an element of resentment in there that Ariel is essentially enslaved by Prospero, but there is also a kind of affection and something of that closeness between them. And I think there's a kind of link as well between, Ariel yearns for his freedom. He wants to be free. He was originally imprisoned in this tree, and Prospero rescued him from that, but he's kind of in bondage to him, and he's a spirit of the air. He wants to be free. And in the same way, there's a kind of link to Data, maybe, who is sort of imprisoned by his mechanical body. He's Pinocchio, we talk about at a different time. But really, in wanting to be human, he wants to kind of move beyond the form that he's trapped in. I mean, in some ways, Data has a sort of human soul, if you think that Data has a soul. It's just that kind of, in a sort of physical, mechanical sense, he's this machine. And really what he wants is to sort of be freed from that in a very kind of Ariel-like way, I'd say.
That's true. That is true. It is the main thrust for Data, and it is something that is... it's a debating point as to whether or not, he does have a soul and he does have that. But there is that definite element of wanting to break free of his programming in many respects. And, when he gets the emotion chip, that is sort of an example of that. It's the next stage of his evolution, by a simple mechanical add-on. But it is always that idea of him being that version of Ariel in that sense, in wanting to break free. So it's interesting how with Emergence, they really sort of zero in on the Tempest parallels, isn't it? And actually make that episode a real key thing. It's interesting as well that Emergence was, I think, like one of the last episodes before All Good Things, before the series finale. And given the Tempest was often considered to be the last farewell for Shakespeare from the theatre, it's almost like a parallel in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's quite deliberate. I mean, they talk about, in that discussion in Emergence, they talk about the fact that, this is kind of the end of something. I mean, Picard says there's something both kind of sad and hopeful about it. And I think that kind of almost fits with the mood of Star Trek at the time. Next Gen was winding up, it was coming to a close, but at the same time, Star Trek itself is this kind of narrative of hope for the future, of this kind of expectation of something bright coming along the line. And I think there's definitely that kind of thematic idea there. As Next Gen is winding up, they kind of choose a story which is about someone, as Picard says, giving up their art, about the kind of final creative act. But we also see in some ways in the way that story plays out, and it's a bit of an odd one, Emergence. I mean, it's not generally a favourite episode of many people, I think, particularly coming so late in Next Gen. You kind of expect something a bit more meaningful in a way. But there are elements of the story that definitely tie into that theme. I mean, there's this idea of creation. The computer is creating this new life form in a sense. But there's also this idea of the sort of wild and wonderful mysteries of the holodeck. And, you made the connection previously about the island of illusion and the holodeck, which is a kind of island of illusion in itself. And in this episode, we see all these holodeck characters who really are interacting in a way not a million miles away from the spirits on Prospero's island, interacting with the human characters and kind of in this slightly puzzling, slightly mysterious, slightly kind of incomprehensible way, but at the same time trying to communicate with them and trying to sort of have an interaction with them.
Yeah, and it's quite fascinating how how looking at the holodeck and looking at the interaction with these characters works in terms of that Shakespearean connection. And obviously, when we talked about the holodeck before, the next generation is a sucker for the holodeck. It really engages that a lot. And in many respects as well, it perhaps not quite to the extent of the original series, but there is plenty of Shakespeare drip through this series as well, isn't it? Whether it's, again, certain episode titles or, more specific references. And obviously the main one being Patrick Stewart, who is, amongst all the people we've talked about, the most directly connected actor to Shakespeare of all of them, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of funny in Emergence that Data is playing Prospero. And I have to say, Data gives quite a bad performance of Prospero, certainly compared to other performances we've seen him give in Next Gen. Patrick Stewart, on the other hand, is the ideal Prospero. He's perfectly cast in that role. I actually saw Patrick Stewart playing Prospero in Stratford a few years ago, and predictably he was brilliant. But it's absolutely in his wheelhouse. It's absolutely the right part for him in a sense. And I suppose that's one of the things that plays into that idea I was saying earlier about the relationship between Picard and Data having that kind of feel of the relationship between Ariel and Prospero. And I think the key line in The Tempest for that really is I played Ariel in a production of The Tempest a few years ago, and it was not an easy character for me to sort of get my head around, because he is a very strange, mysterious character. I think often doesn't really work on stage. And for me, there was one line in the play that actually kind of gave me an insight into the character, and it was really probably through Star Trek, in a sense. He has this line right at the end where he sort of advises Prospero to act with, he says, if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. He's talking about the people who are sort of being punished by the illusions, who are being kind of punished by Prospero, and he's basically encouraging him to forgive them, in a sense, to be the bigger man, to let go of his revenge and his hostility and so on. And Prospero asks him, dost thou think so, spirit, or something to those lines? And Ariel's line is, mine would, sir, were I human, which is exactly what we see again and again in Star Trek. That is a Data line, basically. That is the line of someone who is human, and that's kind of the point, and we see it in Star Trek again and again. Both Spock and Data have these lines, well, if I were human, I would say X. And they also both have this kind of, after their deaths, I mean, obviously those two characters are very closely related. After their deaths, they have their respective captains basically saying, we've got Kirk's famous line of all the souls I'd encountered in my travels, his was the most human. We've got Picard saying something similar about Data after his death in Nemesis. And there's this kind of idea that, in having a line like that, it kind of encompasses this element of kind of transformation, in a sense, or this element of the kind of borderline between the character's kind of alienness or mechanicalness or whatever, and their kind of aspiration. And I talked about how Ariel is, aspiring to freedom and so on, but he also, maybe it's because he's spent too much time around humans, but he has clearly acquired a kind of human morality, in a sense, and a human side to him. So anyway, so when I was trying to get my head around how to play Ariel, that definitely was a kind of grounding point for me, and I think probably the way I did it probably ended up being a kind of quite heavily indebted to Data in some ways. That kind of idea of a sort of slightly innocent, slightly he's a character who doesn't quite understand all the sort of human stuff going around, and he's slightly kind of aloof from it, but at the same time he has there is a humanity to him as well. He's not totally alien. He has a kind of humanity of his own. And, that's something that we see again and again in Star Trek, one way or another.
Do you think that's also why Data is interested in exploring Shakespeare? Because obviously, it's not the first time we see him in Emergence perform Shakespeare. He does... in The Defector, he performs as in Henry V, doesn't he? And it's not the first time that he's doing this. And he obviously does other creative acting pieces or poetry recitals or things like that. It's very much a case of I think he's trying to especially use Shakespeare to kind of explore the human condition and explore it through that text. And I think that's something that they do repeatedly on The Next Generation, especially.
They do, yeah, and certainly through the Picard character, that's something that comes across very clearly. I mean, it's Picard who says to Data, "There's no better way to understand human beings than to study Shakespeare." And and on one level, there's some truth in that. I mean, obviously he's a great writer, but also a very psychologically interesting writer. And I suppose that's part of what Picard is getting at. That Shakespeare presents humanity in a very kind of a sort of, I was going to say sympathetic. It's not exactly sympathetic, but in its kind of broad richness, I suppose, would be one way of looking at it. I mean, that scene in The Defector, interestingly, though, was a last-minute substitution, because this was the episode they were going to bring back Data doing his kind of Sherlock Holmes thing, and this was the episode where they suddenly got sued by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate and told that they weren't allowed to use Sherlock Holmes, and apparently it was 2 days before filming. And so I think it must have been Michael Piller went to Patrick Stewart and said, "Look, we've got this scene that we can't use. We need to do something else instead. What do you reckon?" And it was Patrick Stewart, obviously with his Shakespearean background with the Royal Shakespeare Company and so on, who said, "Well, why don't we do a scene from Henry V instead?" Which played quite well into some of the themes that were kind of in the episode already. And then having made that decision, I think they, in the next kind of rewrite, they started threading them in a little bit more. And that scene is quite unusual, I'd say, for a Star Trek episode. It's quite a long scene. There's quite a lot of Shakespeare, basically, in that. I mean, it's only the teaser, but it's, it's not just a few lines. It's actually like a whole scene of Henry V, pretty much. Unlike with his Prospero, I'd say Data actually does a pretty good job of playing King Henry. And also, of course, Patrick Stewart is there twice in the scene. It's a very interesting decision that it's not Picard playing the role, but Patrick Stewart under very heavy makeup and with a sort of comedy Brummy accent. I don't know know what you make of his comedy.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, that's true.
You know, basically playing this Shakespearean character, and it's a well acted scene. I mean, I think all the performances there, you know, both the two of them, and also there's at least one other guy in the scene, and it feels like a pretty decent bit of Shakespeare production tacked on the beginning of this Star Trek episode. And I suppose it says something about Next Gen's kind of aspirations, about Next Gen's sort of high culture. You know, this is the show where everyone they spend their spare time playing the violin, or do you know what I mean? There's a real sort of high culture element to that show compared to other Star Trek where they, you know, go and play, you know, Captain Proton or whatever. It's a kind of classy sort of, you know, version of leisure and entertainment, and that I suppose really starts with Picard and kind of works down from there in a sense. You know, he is the kind of great noble, sort of wise, kind of cultured, literate character. I mean, of all the captains, he's the one who is the most likely to spend his spare time reading a book. There's a kind of ongoing joke that Picard's a bit of a boring man, really, you know, that he kind of he likes nothing better than to kind of, you know, sit up in his room, you know, reading some old book with a, you know, his smoking jacket sort of thing,
playing the flute at the same time.
Playing the flute, exactly. You know, but it also ties into this idea that actually in one of the earlier Next Gen episodes, Hide and Q, that comes up, where this whole idea of Picard's love of Shakespeare is kind of, again, quite thematically important. And it comes up in his interactions with Q. And he has this speech, he quotes the speech from Hamlet, "What a piece of work is a man." And he says to Q, you know, what Hamlet says, ironically, I say with conviction. In other words, so basically, you know, what Hamlet's saying in that speech is he lists all these noble qualities of humanity, you know, describing this kind of vision of human beings as these kind of perfect, almost angelic creatures. And then at the end of it, Hamlet undercuts himself and he says, "But to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" And, you know, partly that's because Hamlet's feeling depressed and it's to do with his state of mind and so on. But it's also this kind of, you know, as Picard says, it's a kind of sentiment which is put up there and then kind of shot down, but that sentiment, that kind of idea of man as this kind of perfected being, is very much the idea of human beings that we see in Next Gen, and it's quite explicit in some of those early episodes. You know, this evolved sensibility, it comes across in Encounter at Farpoint, it comes across again in this episode, particularly when they're dealing with Q, kind of trying to prove that human beings are not the kind of hopeless, useless savages who do terrible things and so on, but they are actually decent, good people. And, you know, that speech of Hamlet, it ends with this line, "How like a god." And of course what happens in that episode is then Riker is made into a god. You know, Q gives Riker the power of the Q essentially, and tells him to use it however he wishes. And then in fact what we see at the end of the episode is that Riker tries to give his friends all these gifts and they basically reject them, and by rejecting them they sort of prove Picard's point. They prove that they are these evolved characters. They're not going to act out of self-interest. They're going to do the right thing, even if it costs them. And, you know, again, we have Data quoting Shakespeare, quoting Polonius from Hamlet, saying, "To thine own self be true." So again, we've got this kind of idea. It's not just Picard in that episode. The whole crew has kind of absorbed this sort of lofty cultural idea of what Shakespeare stands for and what it means about humanity. And as Picard puts it, this kind of vision of humanity in a sense that he has signed up to, that he's taken from Hamlet.
There's also, what I like about Hyde and Q is when Q probably intentionally misquotes "all the world's a stage" as "all the galaxy's a stage" from As You Like It, which is typical Q, you know, typical Q taking it and, you know, trying to, you know, lampoon it, I think, to an extent, you know, and put it on his own terms. But yeah, it's again an example of the heightened, you know, cultural aspect of the Next Generation. And I do think a lot of that, I mean, as you said, it comes from Picard top down, but I think a lot of that comes itself from Stewart and from his performance and from the way he imbued Picard with that real sense of gravitas in a different way from Shatner. You know, we talked in the previously about Shatner, you know, coming from a Shakespearean background, but there is a difference in the way they perform. And, you know, I mean, I would argue quite strongly that Stewart is the better Shakespearean actor of the two. But it's, you know, he's one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of our age, really. But he manages to really imbue that in Picard as a character and through the performance, and then it filters in. You know, I think then the writers got hold of that and then decided, right, well, we're going to make Picard this learned man. We're going to make him this philosopher. We're going to make him this, you know, this cultural scion of the entire crew, and then it will filter down, and then you will have Data doing Shakespeare plays, and we'll be able to touch on Stewart's own experience and Picard's own, you know, character itself to actually make this work within these stories. And I think it works. It only could work in that way in the Next Generation. You know, I mean, you get. I mean, you do get it in the subsequent, you know, season. You get it in the Deep Space Nine at various points. But I think one key difference. I always think of the scene with Picard and Sisko in Emissary, in which you very clearly get the sense that these are two very, very different men. You know, in that Sisko's got his own interests in terms of, you know, certain elements of culture and things, but there's a lot. It's different. It's very, very, very different between the two of them, and you know immediately that the captain does sort of affect the crew and the show, really, in many respects. It's something that is clear throughout each Star Trek series. The captain is that bulwark, really, of how the show itself unfolds. And you know, Picard is a great example of that in terms of Shakespeare.
Definitely sort of sets the tone. I mean, it's interesting, of course, we know from the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff on Next Gen that actually, in a way, Patrick Stewart was slightly removed to begin with. The rest of them were all kind of joking around the whole time, and he was this rather serious kind of, you know, serious heavyweight actor, and they had to kind of get him out of his shell a little bit and get the same journey we see with Picard in All Good Things, in a sense, you know, by the end of that story, to get him to kind of be one of the group and muck around and be a sort of, you know, as big a troublemaker as Jonathan Frakes or the rest of them. But certainly I think it's true that his performance sets the tone for the show. I mean, it's interesting to sort of imagine, because, you know, there's also this thing about Gene Roddenberry wanting Next Gen to be quite a different show from the original series, about Roddenberry growing up and wanting, you know, having this kind of, Picard is the kind of Roddenberry that he wants, you know, is the man that he wants to be as an older man, in a sense. But at the same time, he wasn't wild about casting Patrick Stewart to begin with. He was a bit sceptical about him, and, you know, there was this real anxiety about, you know, is this bald Englishman really the right man to do this? It was a bold casting decision, and, you know, also someone who wasn't known really for anything other than, you know, known to people who would go to Stratford and see the RSC. He was quite well known, but, you know, other than that, was a bit of an obscure choice in a sense. And it's sort of strange to imagine, you know, if someone else had played that part, how would it have impacted the character? Would we have seen as much Shakespeare in Next Gen? Would we have seen that kind of role of Shakespeare as a kind of touchstone for that series, and that role of Picard as this kind of cultured man? Would that have kind of come across in the same way?
Yeah, I'm not sure it would have done. I think it would have depended on the actor, absolutely. So it's a very key point, that.
And we do see in Next Gen, I suppose, they try to play to the actor's strengths. I mean, with Dr. Crusher, you know, they every time they struggle to come up with a storyline for Dr. Crusher, they kind of, you know, rack their brains for some skill that Gates McFadden has. So she can be doing dancing, or she can be directing plays or something. So it's basically, it's kind of like slightly scraping the bottom of the barrel for characterization. Well, you know, is there anything else in your CV that we could kind of, you know, I mean, probably Patrick Stewart, I'm sure, had fencing on his CV from all the RSC days.
More than likely.
They managed to work that in, and a bit of horse riding and so on. So there's kind of that element to it as well. But I suppose there's also this question that, you know, since we talked about William Shatner and also Patrick Stewart having this Shakespearean background, you know, that maybe that kind of equips them quite well for doing Star Trek. I mean, I know Patrick Stewart certainly felt that his experience with Shakespeare was an advantage to him in dealing with this kind of heightened text, in dealing with this kind of heightened reality. There's a quotation I found from him. He said, "I think that the experience that we get in making a 400-year-old text work is exactly what you need for giving credibility and believability to fantasy, science fiction and the like." And definitely there's that sense that is true, that he can kind of you know, bring those skills to bear. And I know that often with Star Trek, the casting directors would look to theatre actors rather than TV actors, because they felt that they would be more able to kind of cope with the sort of strangeness of it, and the kind of slight alienation of performing in this kind of world that's, you know, it's not a modern soap opera, or it's not like a legal drama or a police procedural or something. It requires, you know, a bit more imagination in a sense, and someone like Patrick Stewart is kind of is well equipped to make that leap and to understand how to do that. Yeah,
that is really interesting about the casting the theatrical actors. You know, it does make a world of sense, because, you know, you do have, even in the episodes that don't feature Shakespeare, you know, you have a very, as we've talked about before, a very heightened reality situation. You know, you have to imagine with Star Trek. It's about imagining a completely different world. It's about imagining a completely different scenario. And it is, science fiction is a very different kind of game to a lot of other genres, you know. And for something like Star Trek, which is, especially with the Next Generation as well, it is shooting for the highbrow. It is shooting for, you know, on the whole, it is shooting for, you know, telling a lot of allegorical stories, telling a lot of stories about the human condition. You know, and a lot of Next Generation, there are quite a lot of Next Generation episodes that are like plays, really. You know, there are quite a lot of, you know, I mean, something like Darmok. I mean, can you imagine something like Darmok being performed by someone other than Patrick Stewart, you know, and the actor who plays it's very specific, very stylized in a way. It's very theatrical, so it does make a world of sense to do that, and I think it probably did help. You know, a lot of these great Star Trek episodes actually sort of organically grow beyond the script, you know, in many respects, and actually punch them up into a different level.
And even the language. I mean, you know, we talked a bit in a previous episode about Nick Meyer getting frustrated. You know, he said, I don't understand why someone would say negative when they could just say no. I mean, even the language of Star Trek has that kind of slightly artificial element to it. I mean, I was just watching The Defector. I was thinking Picard has a line, I want this report with dispatch. Now, that, I mean, first of all, only Captain Picard would say that. None of the other captains in Star Trek would
no way
speak like that. But also that could easily be a line from a Shakespeare play. You know, if you were just given that line in the abstract, you probably would think it was a line from a Shakespeare play, not from a 1990s science fiction series. So there is that kind of element to the way that it's written that sort of ties into that. I mean, people are always sort of saying, you know, oh, if Shakespeare was alive today, he'd be writing EastEnders, or if Shakespeare was alive today, he'd be writing whatever. I actually think if Shakespeare was alive today, he probably would be writing Star Trek.
Yeah, probably.
Perfect format for the combination of kind of lofty ideals, interesting characterization, you know, complex dilemmas, lots of strange alien, you know, larger than life characters, and also language that can, you know, go somewhat beyond the kind of typically pedestrian, realistic, you know, sort of conversational, naturalistic language, you know, that can kind of go beyond that to an extent.
Yeah, and even things as well, like, you know, Picard or the captains retiring to their ready room. It's almost like them going off stage, you know, stage right.
It is, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
It really is. It's that sort of, I'll be in my ready room, off stage they go. And there is a theatricality about the whole setup, really.
Well, the bridge design is very much, you know, actually quite similar to sort of the design of the globe. You know, if you think of the Next Generation bridge, you've got the turbo lift on one side, you've got the conference room on the other, you've got your two upstage doors, then you've got a downstage exit, as you say, to the ready room. You've got that door on the other side. I'm not sure where that actually goes, but you know, it's true. You have very much, and also these levels. You know, you've got a kind of balcony level and then a kind of lower level as well. This sort of playing area, and the thrones. You know, just as you would see in a kind of you know, in a production of Hamlet or something, you have the throne in the centre of the stage. I mean, obviously Kirk only had one throne. Janeway has, you know, her and her kind of stage husband, in effect, have their two thrones side by side. Yeah. Picard has his kind of court, essentially, with his courtiers. And, you know, he's sat there in his central throne. He's got his advisor Riker on one side. He's got his advisor Troy on the other. And there is definitely that element to it, that kind of... you know, consciously or not, I think that kind of, you know, that is there in that setup, in that design. It's sort of built into the structure of that somehow. I mean, we've been talking, I suppose, mainly about sort of the serious side of Shakespeare, about the kind of high culture side of Shakespeare, about these kind of lofty ideals and this kind of lofty characterization and so on. I mean, the other thing it should be said is that even in Next Gen, there is an element of taking the mickey out of themselves, and particularly taking the mickey out of this kind of Patrick Stewart character, of this kind of Picard character. I mean, I mentioned, you know, the rest of the cast ribbing Patrick Stewart and trying to get him to take himself a bit less seriously. You know, we sort of see that playing out as well in the episode. You know, I'm thinking of Menage a Troy, where Captain Picard has to quote Shakespeare in this very over-the-top, you know, again, an example of deliberately bad acting. I mean, Patrick Stewart is great at pretending to be a bad Shakespearean actor and giving this kind of unconvincing performance in his attempt to kind of you know, get the Ferengi to give up Waxana Troy. In Time's Arrow, there's this kind of comedy scene where they you know, they tell the landlady that they're rehearsing A Midsummer Night's Dream, and they all have to play the various parts, and she is again involved in this kind of comedy bad acting. You know, just like we saw, to be honest, with Data in Emergence. You know, Data was doing this sort of hammy John Gielgud impression, basically. You know, not doing a great Shakespearean acting. There's this kind of element of comedy there, and actually that idea of comedy, that idea of the lighter side of Shakespeare, and particularly that sort of anchor of A Midsummer Night's Dream, is something that carries through into Deep Space Nine in probably one of the most explicit adaptations of a Shakespeare play that we see in Star Trek since the original series. Really, is the episode Fascination in Deep Space Nine is basically A Midsummer Night's Dream in space. Effectively, it's very consciously riffing on that story, on that theme, on the kind of mood of that play as well, which is quite light and quite silly and quite sort of frivolous in a sense. And I know with that episode they knew it was the episode that immediately preceded Past Tense, which is obviously a pretty dark, serious, heavy episode, and they kind of wanted a sort of light, sort of a bit of frippery in a sense, a bit of a kind of palate cleanser before they got to that real heavyweight story. And this was the one they came up with. And apparently the writers were very influenced, in particular, by the 1930s film adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and really worked that story into the episode that they wrote, in quite a kind of blatant way, I suppose. But I would say a way that works pretty well. I mean, I think it's interesting, that episode. It is very light. It is very kind of inconsequential. But at the same time, because Deep Space Nine does character work so well, you sort of buy into it and you enjoy it in a way that I think that even if Next Generation had tried to do that episode, I don't think it would have come off in the same way, because I don't think the character interaction was as sort of amenable to that kind of comedy in a way. I mean, if you think about, say, The Naked Now, where they tried to sort of make everyone behave weirdly and so on, it's kind of slightly cringeworthy, whereas Deep Space Nine, they can all act totally out of character, they can all do ridiculous things, they can make complete fools of themselves, but somehow there's enough charm and enough sort of believability to the characters underneath that it works, against the odds, I'd say.
Well, that's exactly it. You're absolutely right. With Fascination, I mean, it's the first real example on Deep Space Nine where they decide, right, we're going to completely just be really flippery and flippant and have fun and make this a real romp and be really silly. It's the first proper, I'd say, full example of that in the entire, and they had the confidence by this point in season 3 to be able to balance that and do the two, because, like you said, they'd invested the characterization enough that to see, Kira and Bashir snogging like horny teenagers on the promenade, is funny in itself without being, oh my God, like you said, The Naked Now is a great example of one where you go, oh no, please stop. But it's earned in Deep Space Nine, and it works in that sense of being able to take these very serious, characters with a lot of, some of them, like someone like Kira again, for example, who's got this really sort of dark backstory in many respects, and he's often very strong-willed and severe, and then to have her be completely uninhibited is really, it works really well, and it is in the great tradition of A Midsummer Night's Dream and Shakespeare, of that kind of comedy of misunderstanding, comedy of farce, comedy of love potions and throwing people into these different entanglements, and it's fun, and it's surprising really actually how well it works in Deep Space Nine. You wouldn't think it would.
No,
but it does.
I mean, on paper, it sounds like. I mean, funnily enough, when we were sort of planning this episode, you and I were saying, oh well, we might not have time to both watch all the episode we're going to discuss, so we'll sort of divide them up. And I took Fascination, thinking slightly with gritted teeth, thinking, oh, because I sort of had a vague memory of it, but I wasn't really expecting that much. And actually, when I watched it, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. And I think it is interesting. Deep Space Nine is by far the darkest of the Trek series, but also, probably does the best comedy.
It can do at times,
and I think it's partly the writing, it's partly the characterization, but it's very well directed. It's Avery Brooks directed it with just the right balance, just the right touch to kind of bring out the comedy from the situations, but without sort of going for the laughs in a way that is cringeworthy and alienating, if you know what I mean. The laughs are there, the behaviour generates that kind of amusement, and really it works very well. And also it's sort of one of the interesting things, there's this kind of whole Bajoran festival going on at the time, and even in the kind of music and so on, there's this sort of, the Bajoran music has this sort of slightly twee Shakespearean, I mean, I haven't seen that 1930s Midsummer Night's Dream, but exactly what you think of as that kind of old-fashioned version of Shakespeare, do you know what I mean? So even in something like the music and the costuming and so on, there's this kind of slight sort of subtle hinting of this kind of world that's going on behind the story in a sense, or behind the play that they're actually presenting.
Yeah, it really does, and it's I always enjoyed Fascination. I really had a soft spot for it back in the day. Again, and Deep Space Nine does similar to The Next Generation in that it again has titles of episodes that borrow from Shakespeare, like the past prologue, which is only the second episode after Emissary, borrows from The Tempest, again, to talk about The Tempest, what's past his prologue, which is another famous line. Heart of Stone in season 3, that title is taken from Twelfth Night, where I have said too much into a heart of stone. So there's lots of, even in this, there are lots of Shakespeare allusions. Once more into the breach, he's probably one of the most recognisable as an episode title, the season 7 episode, which is the famous Henry V line, one of the most famous Shakespeare lines of all. So and then the Dogs of War, obviously, as well in season 7, taken from Julius Caesar, which again, it goes back to General Chang and things like that in terms of what he says. So again, they're tapping into the same well, in many respects, even if the approach isn't necessarily as full on and as highbrow as in The Next Generation.
Although there are moments which sort of tie into that kind of not just the episode. I mean, I think that there's kind of the titles of the episodes which are obviously it's a bit like you have two types of music, don't you? You have the music that the characters can hear, and you have the music that is imposed as part of the structure of the art, if you know what I mean. Like, they don't know what the name of the title of the episode is, but there are also like references, in dialogue and so on. And I'm thinking Improbable Cause and the Dyer's Cast actually has this kind of theme of Julius Caesar running through it, because the first of those episodes opens with Bashir has given Garrick some Shakespeare to read, and he's read Julius Caesar, and basically Garrick says, well, this is a rubbish play, this is ridiculous. How can you take this guy seriously when he didn't see that all his friends were plotting to kill him, and that he didn't see this assassination attempt coming? But then actually later on in the Dyer's Cast, to some degree the same thing happens. The Tane character doesn't see things coming, and Garrick quotes Cassius at him, "The fault, dear Tane, is not in our stars but in ourselves." So he's sort of in some ways sort of absorbed a lesson maybe from that play that he dismissed initially. But there's also this sense that Garrick himself, in his backstory with Tane, is maybe kind of inspired by the story of Julius Caesar, because he says that he betrayed him, but never in my heart. And it's very much that kind of theme of, Brutus, who is kind of Caesar's closest friend in a sense, but feels he has to act against him and has to take part in the assassination, even though it troubles him deeply on a kind of moral level and on a personal level. He feels he's doing the right thing. And with Garrick, there's this sense that, and I don't think we ever quite get to the bottom of what happened in that relationship, but, there was a betrayal, but at the same time, he feels like in his heart, he never truly betrayed him. So there's the kind of connection there between their backstory, in the past, as well as the story that's happening in the present, and the kind of themes of the play that they are discussing in both those episodes. And also, I was interested, reading up on those episodes, René Aubergenois was talking about the torture scenes that happened between Odo and Garrick. And he said that he said, I felt like some character from King Lear, and the acting method I used was very Shakespearean. I don't know exactly what he means by that, but, it's interesting. So he approached it as a scene from a Shakespeare play almost, or as he would have approached a scene from a Shakespeare play. Again, sort of going back to that idea that, Patrick Stewart was saying that he'd been equipped with skills as a sort of classical actor that he could bring to that kind of stylized reality, or to that kind of style of storytelling on Star Trek. And really, René Aubergenois was saying the same kind of thing, that his kind of Shakespearean approach would inform that in a way.
Well, again, that doesn't surprise me. He's one of the actors on Deep Space Nine who has among the most gravitas in the way he delivers his lines and the way he plays Odo throughout a lot of and in that scene, that quite harrowing torture scene where Odo is effectively melting and being killed. It's quite, I love those episodes. The Dyer's Cast especially is just a phenomenal piece of television. But those scenes where Garrick is torturing Odo, it's powerful stuff to watch, and you really. So I think maybe he was tapping into just that real sense of, as he says, Lear, that sort of tragic figure who is just being betrayed, by somebody close to him in a sense, somebody in terms of Garrick, somebody who he's, if not trusted, then he's at least come to believe isn't the enemy. And then, and as we say, Garak then turns on Tane ultimately, and as you said, their relationship is complex, and ultimately, I'm pretty sure, if I remember rightly, Garak is Tane's son in the run-out. So yeah, it gets even more complicated in that way.
Also with Odo, there's that, I mean, just thinking of Lear, there's that kind of element of Gloucester being blinded in Lear, and the kind of, I suppose there's an element of that in that scene, that Odo starts off very kind of cocky and, you know, like mocking Garak, and then ends up being kind of debased by him to an extent, and kind of really humiliated by him and victim in that situation. So you could sort of see the parallels that maybe he's getting at there with that kind of a scene.
And I think it sort of goes along the lines of the fact that Deep Space Nine itself has a lot of very Shakespearean kind of characters, doesn't it? I mean, it has people who, you know, it's quite often, in fact, more so the recurring characters, really, the side characters who come into this huge tapestry that ends up being weaved with the Dominion War and the Founders and, you know, the Bajoran mystery and everything like that, everything that all weaves together in the end in this brilliant tapestry. You do get the sense of these very Shakespearean theatrical characters along, you know. I mean, Nicholas Meyer wouldn't have been amiss writing for that show, because it's the same kind of archetypes in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned once more Into the Breach, the character of Kor was actually deliberately based on a Shakespearean character. It was based on Falstaff from Henry IV plays. I'd never sort of realised that. I mean, I'd watched the Kor episodes and I hadn't made that connection, but once you're aware of it, it kind of is staring you in the face in a way.
Yeah, it really is, you know, and it's I watched the Core trilogy, as I call it, for this episode. You had obviously Blood Oath, and then The Sword of Kalis, and then once more Into the Breach, and you do see a real arc with Core as somebody who was a great warrior. He's ends up being part of a band with his best friends to go off and slay a villain from their history, and then he loses his friends and he's a man on his own, and then each time you see Kor, he's trying to regain his honour in various different ways. You know, whether it's trying to take out an old enemy, whether in the Sword of Kalis he's battling his own antipathy with Worf, and then ultimately battling himself, as does Worf, when they get this ancient Klingon relic which seems to have powers of, you know, of almost mind control over them, and actually turn them in on themselves and make them savage in many respects. And then he has to overcome that and find when he wants to actually use that as a source of power. And then once more Into the Breach, he's regaining his honor in a final, you know, battle to die as a Klingon. And so it is all about somebody really going through that arc. And it taps into what we've talked about before with the Klingons being very Shakespearean, you know, being very along those lines of the kind of characters who you know, tap into those Shakespearean themes. And Kor's a great example, and the Falstaff links are very clear. And it works really well. It works really well as a story. Absolutely,
yeah. And I mean, I suppose also with Kor, what's quite interesting, and I know that the actor was quite hesitant to reprise that role when he first got the script for Blood Oath, I think, because he's quite different from the character in the original series in a sense. I think he felt like in the original series he was this kind of very sort of respected antagonist in a way, like he was a certain kind of character, and really in the Deep Space Nine episodes, there's a lot more comedy. I mean, the way he works as this kind of Falstaff character is he sort of combines these comic story with a kind of tragedy, a sort of tragicomedy in a sense, in the same way that Falstaff does. There's also this, you know, all these references to him being really fat, which I always found slightly odd, because actually he doesn't look that much fatter than the other Klingons. But obviously, again, there's that kind of idea. He's meant to be sort of physically ridiculous. He's meant to, in the same way as Falstaff is this kind of physically ridiculous character. And actually, the weird thing about those, particularly Henry IV plays, you know, the character of Falstaff, his ridiculousness sort of ties into his tragedy somehow. I mean, we were talking earlier about David Warner. I think probably the best Shakespearean performance I've ever seen was actually David Warner playing Falstaff. And, you know, totally, this was in Stratford again, totally cast against type. I mean, not really the sort of role you'd expect from him. You know, you think of him as quite sort of serious and weighty and, you know, a bit sort of gravelly. Falstaff obviously is quite a comic character, quite sort of broad, this huge, you know, ridiculous man. It was just an absolutely sublime performance, really, really funny, but also, you know, I mean, one of my great regrets is that I saw Henry IV Part 1 and I didn't get a ticket for Part 2, and I've always wished I'd gone back to see it, because even in Part 1, which is where more of the kind of comedy is, there were kind of hints of the sort of tragic elements of that story to come, and of his sort of fall from grace and so on. There were kind of hints in there that were intensely moving just from the way that Warner played them and so on. But, obviously in Part 2, that's where you kind of get the big payoff with all of that. And, I'm sure his performance was even more wonderful in that. But Falstaff is a really interesting character, a kind of, I guess, again, what we're saying about Deep Space Nine, being able to combine the tragic and the comic so well, being able to kind of juggle those issues of tone. And also definitely very Shakespearean. I mean, particularly in Once More Until the Breach, aside from the fact that you have this Shakespearean title, he even speaks. I mean, I talked earlier about Picard speaking kind of vaguely Shakespearean lines. Core in that episode, basically, he has this sort of, because he's sort of losing his mind. He's got a kind of Klingon dementia or something. Basically, he's very confused and losing track of reality and which battle he's fighting and so on. But he has this sort of moment of lucidity where his confusion kind of falls away, and he speaks this line, which is basically, it sounds like a kind of Shakespearean couplet. He says, "Savour the fruit of life, my young friends. It has a sweet taste when it's fresh from the vine, but don't live too long. The taste turns bitter after a time." I mean, that is, again, very poetic. I mean, even by, Star Trek standards, extremely poetic writing, and, and self-consciously and deliberately so. That's this character sort of, we see this in Shakespeare again and again, the difference between like the low-life characters talking in prose and the noble characters speaking in verse. I mean, that's kind of Core rising up to the level of verse, in a sense, rising up to this rhyme, rising up to this kind of noble, artful mode of expression that is this kind of, when we talk about the Klingon culture, and obviously there's all the like fighting with swords and drinking wine and, making a mess of everything and causing chaos, but there is also this kind of nobility and this kind of culture of this kind of courtly ideal, in a sense. And I suppose that's Core kind of rising back up and reclaiming that kind of courtly past that he's had, in a sense, and very much in this sort of Shakespearean mould.
Yeah, and it fits his character story and the ultimate fate for Core really well. And I think that's something that carries through into a lot of these characters who in Deep Space Nine, who have these Shakespearean sort of tropes or illusions and things like that, and I think one of the biggest, in a similar way to Khan, is Ducat, who is, even though he may never quote Shakespeare, he is a Shakespearean character through and through. For me, outside of Khan, he is the greatest villain of the Star Trek universe by far. He's just amazingly performed by Mark Alamo all the way through, but he has one of the greatest character arcs I think I've ever seen in a villain in any kind of fiction ever. And he goes through so many Shakespearean kind of ups and downs and complications and entanglements and delusions of unbelievable grandeur and egotism that he is just amazing to watch, and it would have been amazing to see him quote Shakespeare. Actually, I would have loved that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose one of the reasons that Shakespeare provides such great villains is because he doesn't write them as. I mean, he does occasionally write villain characters, but essentially he writes anti-heroes. He doesn't write villains. I mean, if you think about Ducat, you think of maybe Richard III or Macbeth, but these are villainous characters in a sense, but they're also the hero of their story. They're the tragic hero, and as unpleasant as, say, someone like Richard III, in moral terms is a villain, but in theatrical terms is the hero of the story. And I suppose with Ducat, you get that element of that. There's a lot of interest in his psychology. There's a lot of interest in his potential for redemption. There's a lot of interest in sort of why he does what he does. Really taking this character seriously. And treating him as a complex character. The reason he's such a great villain is because he's so ambiguous and so complex. And every time he does something awful, he then surprises you by doing something, unexpectedly generous, or, and that's a big part of it. And even other villains. I mean, like Kai Wynn, for example, is an interesting villain because, again, she's just a sort of skin-crawlingly obnoxious, horrible woman, but at the same time she does have occasional virtues. Sometimes she does things for good reasons, and she also, you can feel sorry for her. I mean, there's an element of, you can understand why she feels so disappointed in her life. Things haven't worked out for both her and Ducat. I suppose there's this real, I mean, actually, Zachary and Mike and I on Metatrex were talking about this a while ago when we were talking about season 6 of Deep Space Nine, this kind of idea of resentment, which is a big part of Ducat's character. It's also a massive part of Kai Wynn's character. This kind of resentment at her life not having, even though she's acquired all this power and so on, the fact that the prophets don't speak to her, the fact that she's sort of, that she has to deal with the emissary stealing her thunder. And these things are understandable. There is something kind of sad about her character as well as sort of repulsive. She's also got in Shakespearean terms, she's got a real kind of Mark Antony style to her. That idea of kind of dishonesty, of being able to twist your words to say one thing but have the opposite, manipulating people in a way. If you think of Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar, it's very much, he keeps saying, well, I'm here to do one thing, I'm not trying to make political points, he says I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him, but he keeps saying over and over again, these are honourable men, if they said this, then they must be honourable men, but the way he says it is basically to say the opposite, and it's very much that kind of the way that Kai Wynn deals in this sort of dishonest language the whole time, and Ducat as well, equally a dishonest, a liar, essentially a compulsive liar. Definitely both very kind of Shakespearean kind of characters, but elsewhere in Star Trek we see characters who have kind of Shakespearean aspects to them. I mean, we were talking about the Klingons. Worf, I'd say, is a kind of Coriolanus character. This kind of noble warrior who just can't cope with the sort of vicissitudes of politics and the way that the world really is. I mean, that's the story of Coriolanus. Basically, is he's this great hero and so on, but he just can't deal with the political arena. He can't deal with kind of people having personal interests, people who don't act out of honour and that kind of warrior code. And you see that certainly with Worf. In some of the other Klingon storylines, like we see towards the end of Deep Space Nine, the desire to get rid of Gowron. Gowron is this kind of weak leader who has to be removed. I mean, again, there's kind of shades of Julius Caesar there. There's also maybe Richard II. You have this kind of theme of the king who is, he's hurting his country and has to be, removed for the greater good in a sense. Again, there's a kind of, definitely a sort of Shakespearean inflection there. And we see in, sticking with Deep Space Nine, in statistical probabilities, we see, again, sort of Shakespearean allusions, Shakespearean quotes being used to describe the situation with Cardassia, with Ducat and Dumas, the characters in that, the genetically engineered characters, when they watch the video of Dumas, and they have this kind of insight into what's happened, this kind of miraculous insight, really, into what's happened, that they can divine the whole, course of several episodes worth of plot basically from this one speech. They see him very much in terms of these kind of archetypes. They say he's a pretender, but they also see him in terms of Shakespearean quotations. They quote Macbeth, Dumas doth murder sleep, which is, Macbeth doth murder sleep when he's racked with guilt in a sense. They use the line uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, which is from Henry IV, and again a reference to to Henry IV, who is Bolingbroke in Richard II, the man who deposed the previous king, and ended up taking the crown himself. So they kind of pile these. They use their understanding of Shakespeare to understand the contemporary politics of what's happened with the Cardassians and with that regime, and it's a kind of, like I say, sort of almost magical insight. And then there's also the fact that those characters are themselves almost Shakespearean tropes, because they're, on one level, they're the kind of autistic savant, but they're also the kind of wise fool that you see in Shakespeare. The fool who is supposedly just a bit of a clown, a bit of an idiot, but actually says the things that no one else can say. And the kind of blurred line that you see in a lot of Shakespeare's plays between kind of madness, mental illness, and sort of insight, and putting your finger on something and speaking truth in a sense, in a way that other people are not willing to acknowledge.
It is in a lot of Deep Space Nine episodes, isn't it? A lot of these allusions, these characters who fit certain tropes and roles within Shakespearean plays. It doesn't seem to be something that is in a massive amount of Voyager or Enterprise, though, really, Shakespeare. It sort of trails off after Deep Space Nine, doesn't it, really, in terms of a lot of the references and allusions.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, you get maybe the odd reference. I mean, in the episode Tuvix, you get a bit of a sort of reprise of Shylock's famous speech from The Merchant of Venice. You get Tuvix saying, when I'm happy, I laugh. When I'm sad, I cry. I'm flesh and blood and I have the right to live. And there's this element of this kind of, the character who's proving their humanity. We see that again, I suppose, with Data in A Measure of a Man and with the Doctor in Voyager as well, the character who has to kind of stake their claim to being treated as a human being, or maybe not literally a human being, but as a sort of sentient life form who deserves to be treated in a certain way. We see it, ironically, in Far Beyond the Stars. That's what Benny Russell says. He says, I'm a human being, damn it. It's exactly that same kind of appeal. Don't abuse me, don't dismiss me in a way, like recognise my humanity and my right to be treated in a certain way. So there's that kind of allusion there. There may be a few other little references. In Enterprise, there's quite a funny scene in the episode Cogenitor where basically Archer has made friends with this alien captain, and Hoshi has given him the complete works of Shakespeare to read because he's interested in human culture. And he comes back basically saying he read the lot the previous night because he's a fast reader. And he starts talking to Archer about Hamlet a bit. And Archer, unlike Picard, is probably like the least literate character as far as we can see. I mean, I don't know that we ever see him. The only time I can think of we see him reading a book, it's a joke because T'Pol has given him this tedious Vulcan philosophy book, and he's clearly not really going to read it. Whereas Captain Picard, when he goes on holiday, he takes a big stack of books.
Yeah.
So that it's kind of played for comedy. So the alien captain starts talking to Archer about Shakespeare. Archer can just about cope with a very surface level conversation about Shakespeare. Then he says to him, I thought I might move on to Sophocles. Do you have any tips on which plays I might enjoy? And Archer basically changes the subject very quickly because clearly, he's not equipped to answer that question in the way that Captain Picard could probably have, given him a whole reading list.
Absolutely.
And even a sort of lecture on the subject. But, I think we see certainly with Captain Archer, I always think there's a bit of a link between him and the kind of, we were talking about in other episodes, the kind of war on terror context for Enterprise and so on. There's a slight George W. Bush aspect to Archer. He's very folksy. He's a bit of a kind of, he likes watching sports and drinking beer and eating his pretzels and so on. He's not the kind of cultured captain that we maybe grew to expect. He's from Picard, to a limited expect from Sisko. And again with Janeway, she reads Dante. She's quite she has a sort of highbrow interest as well, but certainly not to the extent of Picard.
I think he's a bit more Sisko probably, Archer, than any of them. I think he'd get on all right with Sisko. He'd be able to talk to him about baseball and things like that. So I think they'd have a certain shared thing. But I know what you mean. It does tail off a bit, and I think maybe that's a sign of the fact that they'd exhausted a lot of it in previous years, or they felt like it didn't quite fit the tone of the other shows, or maybe they were just moving away a little bit in terms of what they wanted to focus on. But I think overall, Shakespeare seems to be overall a really good fit with Trek, doesn't it? Like we said earlier, yeah, I think it really does sort of make a lot of these episodes even more classical and interesting and reflective.
Definitely. I mean, I wonder whether with Voyager and Enterprise, to an extent, there's a kind of move to make the characters a bit more relatable. I mean, if you think of someone like Tom Paris, he's obsessed with kind of 20th century popular culture, and there's a kind, so he's kind of more. He's not of our time, but there's more of a kind of link to our own time, and there may be more relatable characters. With Enterprise, even more so, they swear a bit, and they kind of, there's all these kind of gestures to sort of say, well, these people are not that different from us. They're certainly not the evolved humans of the future, and maybe that comes across that Shakespeare sort of, slightly falls a little bit by the wayside in those series in favour of other kind of cultural touchstones. In Voyager, it's the kind of schlock sci-fi stuff. Again, I mean, like Captain Proton and so on. Again, in Enterprise, there's, the movie night is all these kind of old black and white kind of pulpy B-movies, basically. That seems to be the kind of human culture that people are interested in and that they relate to, rather than kind of what we would think of as sort of lofty classic literature in a sense.
Yeah, I think there could be something to that, definitely. And a changing sort of example of how people are engaging with Star Trek, and they want things a little bit more relatable to, the modern day. Who knows? It is interesting, potentially, yeah, how that is a signifier of how Star Trek's changing as well.
And it's possibly, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, moving forward. I mean, obviously we've got Discovery coming up along the line. We know Nick Meyer's been working on that. I mean, we talked a little bit in our episode about the Wrath of Khan, about the influence, what he might bring from a kind of literary, having a passion for literature, what he might bring to that. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what role, if any, Shakespeare plays in that story. But I mean, just sort of thinking about broadly this kind of issue of, what is it about Star Trek and Shakespeare that kind of binds them together? I mean, I suppose when we single out Voyager and Enterprise like that, the other thing we're doing, I mean, we talked in our holodeck episode, I mentioned the person who made the list of all the holodeck episodes, and pointed out there was only one in Deep Space Nine, and sort of jokingly said, and that gives you an indication of why Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek series. I mean, most people, if they were going to rank their Star Trek series, Voyager and Enterprise are the ones that kind of fall down to the bottom. And it sort of makes me think, is there, what does that tell us? Does that tell us something about, that there's something missing from those series that maybe the kind of the Shakespeare connection taps into? I mean, I suppose one of the things that, if you think about why is there such a good fit, we talked a bit about the kind of heightened reality of Star Trek. We talked a bit about the sort of heightened language and so on, the kind of performance ideas. But I think there's also an idea that Shakespeare has a sort of a sensibility that's very well suited to Star Trek. He has a very, an extraordinary creative mind, extraordinary imagination. Like I said before, I think he would be writing Star Trek if he was alive today, and if they were producing it. But also a kind of real humanistic approach to people. I mean, I think, one of the things that makes Shakespeare so interesting is that as much as there are these kind of grand plots and these sort of over-the-topness to some of it, and this kind of richness to the poetry, the language and so on, there's also this great kind of psychological penetration of the way that people behave, and the relationships between people, and the complexities of motivation, and all these kind of things. It's one of the reasons that people love those plays. But there's also a kind of social conscience, I think, in a lot of his dramas, that kind of comes through, maybe comes through between the cracks. And I was thinking, there's I don't know if you've seen it. There's a kind of there's a on the rounds, doing the rounds on the internet. There's Ian McKellen, basically, for the last few years, has been reciting. As far as I can see, anytime anyone asks him to come and do a speech about something, he recites this speech from Henry VIII, which is the only piece of manuscript that's known to be written in Shakespeare's handwriting. It was a play that was written by various people, but he had a hand in it. And the assumption is that he at least wrote this famous speech because it's in his handwriting. It's the only example of his handwriting. And that speech, it's a really wonderful piece of writing, and it's basically it's about the reason that Ian McKellen goes around reciting the whole time is it's about immigrants and about refugees and about how do you treat these people who have nothing, and they come to your country and they ask for help. Do you throw them out? Do you treat them with cruelty? And how would you like to be treated if you were in their situation? And it's very much that kind of, I don't know, just something about watching Ian McKellen, who also is this, of course, great Shakespearean, famous Royal Shakespeare Company actor, also obviously, as we know, best friends with Patrick Stewart. They're kind of they're contemporaries. I mean, if you watch, I don't know if you've seen those old videos that they made at the RSC back in the 70s, but fascinating series of videos about playing Shakespeare. You can watch them on YouTube, and you can see the young Patrick Stewart and the young Ian McKellen in the rehearsal room, doing their speeches and getting their then getting their sort of feedback from the director and so on. So they sort of, have that parallel there. But I just think when you listen to that speech, there's this real sense of, it's exactly that kind of social conscience that you get in Star Trek. It's exactly that kind of use of allegory to sort of make a point, to kind of make the audience, what Hamlet says, that art is a way of holding up a mirror to people and forcing them to look at themselves and looking at their society and looking at their culture. And then, hopefully they see things afresh, they see things anew, they kind of learn something. And that's certainly the theme that we get in Hamlet. We talked a bit previously about the conscience of the king and the way that the play is used, both in that episode and in the play Hamlet, to kind of illuminate moral failings or whatever. But, Absolutely, there's this idea that art is a way of showing people something true through a fiction, and I suppose that is absolutely what Star Trek is doing. In its use of allegory and its use of, that's what our show is about. Really, is about how the real world interacts with the fiction in Star Trek, and that is what Star Trek does. It sort of processes these real things and these influences, cultural influences, historical influences, and so on, and it they go through the kind of Star Trek machine, and they come out as these kind of interesting, entertaining science fiction stories.
And you can't get more of a cultural touchstone, really, than Shakespeare, can you? Really,
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's why it's so pervasive, and that's why it works so well in Star Trek.
Absolutely, it's it's really the sort of heart of the same kind of way of looking at humanity and our place in the world or in the galaxy. Well, it's been fun treading the boards on the Starship Enterprise, but Tony and I had better make our exits, stage left. So
to the ready room.
Off to the ready room. So here's a look at what else has been going on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Orb.
After the Captain's documentary, I think we all wish that there had been a piano in Sisko's quarters. And at some point in every episode, someone walked in and he was just over in the corner, rambling away.
Warp 5.
And there's a wipe from right to left in the screen, and you never see that on Star Trek. It completely pulls me out of the episode every time I see it.
Thanks a lot, because I've never noticed it before.
I didn't notice it.
Ever! Now I'm going to see it. Okay.
You just ruined the entire episode for everyone listening.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
The 602 Club.
That's a really smart idea, because that's also something that, Caesar sees, is that we're not that different.
The Ready Room.
As with so many places, CBS, in marketing the show and getting it out to as many eyeballs as possible, they're obviously wanting fans and armchair fans and maybe would-be fans, genre fans who might give Star Trek but they're still trying to get out to the great unwashed and the mundanes, and this is actually stretching the season out beyond 15 actual weeks.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended all right.
grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, with their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silenced by your brawl, and you in ruff of your opinions clothed. What had you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled. And by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reason, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes feed on one another. Oh, desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace. And your unreverent knees make them your feet to kneel to be forgiven. You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, and lead the majesty of law in Liam to slip him like a hound. Say now, the king, as he is clement, if the offender mourn, should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France, or Flanders, to any German province, Spain, or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owned not nor made not you, nor that the elements were not all appropriate to your comfort, but chartered unto them. What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity.